Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast where I bring the conversations I have in my vintage shop with customers, friends, right to you. Now, the last time we spoke, it was mid-December. I believe my last episode was December 12th, 2023. Here we are in 2024, and you'll be probably hearing this episode in March, and it really does feel like time flies. So on that ending episode in December, it was kind of a recap of 2023, things that are on the horizon. And before we hop into the main portion of the episode today, I wanted to give a quick little update on the shop, where the shop's at, where I'm at. Because as much as it's only been 3 months, a lot happens. And it's easy to lose track of time, especially if you have ADHD like me. So one of the biggest things that I've changed so far in 2024, and if you follow the shop on social media like Instagram and Facebook at Carmine and Hayworth, you'll know that about a month ago, I announced that I was going to be taking an extra day off from the shop. I typically am always closed on Mondays. I decided for the first time in 5 years, I'm going to close on a Tuesday as well. So I get 2 days in a row off, which for anybody that knows me, who's been in the shop, I'm there all the time. The shop is my life. I don't have a very easy time separating work and home life balance. So having this extra day off has been interesting. It's been very hard stepping away from the shop for an extra day, just to be able to take care of my mental health and recuperate a little bit. I've talked about this in the past, but owning your own shop, doing everything for it, doing the graphics, social media, in-store, online, everything, burnout is real. And I needed to do something before it got to the point where I wouldn't be useful for anything. But on the next episode, I am going to be talking a little bit more about this, because it's going to be an episode on burnout as a small business owner and how to deal with that and cope with it and live with it. So this is something that we'll pick up on later. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that. But also what I've been taking time to do over, was it the holidays or was it in January? I can't remember, honestly. But I've been reorganizing the shop archive. And what has come with that is I've been scaling down some of the pieces and selling some of the pieces that I've had in the archive that I don't feel fit with what I'm trying to do. I love them. They're beautiful, but they deserve to go to a new home. And that's been cathartic. Releasing pieces that I've been collecting for years and years and years out back into the world where they can be loved and appreciated by so many more people. It's hard. It's like I'm letting go of my children. But it's been really good. And the pieces have been going to people that I know who are going to appreciate them and give them a whole new life. And that has been one of my goals this year. As I said in the episode in December, I want this year to be a year of change and evolution. Without getting too weird and philosophical about it, in business, it's easy to get stagnant and get complacent, and I never want that to happen because I get bored very easily. So I constantly need to be finding new ways to keep myself interested. And scaling back on some of the archival pieces has been a really great motivator. Brings back memories of when I first bought some of these pieces, the stories behind them, and knowing that someone else is going to be able to experience the excitement for those that I no longer have. So that's been really cool. So if you keep an eye out on our social media and website, I leave little hints about what's going to be to come, and I've been listing a lot of the archival pieces on the vintage section of our website. But some of the other changes that I've made, I guess it's not really a change. It's just reformatting how I've been doing things involving the shop. And in prior years, I had been really highly motivated to do a lot of in-store and collaboration events. A couple years ago, we did something called the Shindig, where we had my friends who are in this amazing all-female band play music. It was a fundraiser for a local animal shelter. We had entertainers, drinking, dancing. It was so much fun. We did a couple of those, and they were amazing. I did an in-store Valentine's Day event called Get a Heart On, which was sex-related. So much fun. But as I'll talk about in another episode, you get burned out very fast. Your creative energy just gets depleted. But I don't want to let go of that. So this year I have been working on pre-planning events that still hold that spirit, but I get to put more of my energy into it without spreading myself too thin. So I'm doing more tailored events that are more closely related to my shop and some of the historical things that I've been wanting to push, especially with the archive. And there's one particular event that I've been collaborating and working on that until I can get things solidified a little bit more, I can tell you all about. But if you're a fan of the Hollywood memorabilia that I've been collecting and talking about, this event is definitely going to be for you. So keep your ears open because I will be talking about that. I've also been jumping back into photo shoots. I have realized that part of my love of my shop is that I love styling. I don't want to be a stylist, like a personal stylist, but I love styling photo shoots and creative projects. And that's been something I've been getting back into with my amazing photographer friends and doing more meaningful collaborations. And I have examples of those up on our website in the lookbook section. And I'm really, really proud of what me and my friends have been able to do in terms of bringing more relevance to vintage clothing and modernizing it and making them not so scary and literal. I know I had more notes about updates I was going to give, but I have several different notebooks that I keep notes in for the podcast, and I have a main one that I misplaced. So in coming episodes, this will probably be a continuation because I know I've forgotten about something, but this year it's going to be a different year, and it's nerve-wracking. It's scary. We're in uncharted territory. The world is different now than when I started my shop back in 2018, and trying to navigate all the changes that have come with it has been really daunting and hard. And that's why this podcast has been a great release, where it's meant for me just to be able to get out my thoughts and have a place where there are no expectations. My livelihood doesn't rest on this podcast. It's purely just because I love doing it. And that has been amazing. So hopefully there'll be more episodes this year. But now that we got all that out of the way, let's hop in to the topic of today's episode that I am very passionate about. Before I go into the difference between a vintage store, thrift store, and consignment store, I'm just going to throw some definitions out at you, just so some things I'm talking about make a little bit more sense. Now, when I say vintage, different vintage shops and vintage sellers all have their own definition. It didn't used to be so broad, but shops like mine follow the 25 and older when considering vintage. Now, that's not to be confused with antique, because antique is 100 years and older, and vintage is anything from 25 years going up to that point. Some shops go by 20 years. I've met more sellers that are using the 10-year mark, but mainly 20 to 25 years is the generally accepted rule for vintage. And that's what vintage shops like mine follow. Which means I do carry some 90s pieces, but I'm very selective on which ones those are. Now, when you hear thrift, you often hear the term secondhand, or if you're on Depop and I wanted to say Pinterest, Poshmark, you'll also see the term pre-loved. And all of these generally mean the same. So secondhand is an item that had been owned before. Pre-loved, I think, is a newer way of describing secondhand pieces that were loved before. But truly they mean the same thing. And thrift stores meld into that. That's kind of the umbrella term, I would say, which means all of these pieces were previously owned. So the reason why learning the differences between these kind of shops and terms are really important, because it all goes back to being an informed shopper, being an informed buyer, and knowing where you are going and spending your money. Now, that sounds a little cryptic, but what I mean by that is just expecting and knowing what you're walking into. And I'll explain more of that when I go over the differences between the shops. But just keep that thought in mind and see if, as you're listening, you can start to see what the importance of differentiating and knowing those terms will be. I'm going to use my shop as the example for vintage store, because obviously that's the one I know more about. I wrote the rules for my specific shop, therefore I'm the best one to speak on it. So as I said, my vintage shop, with all of the vintage we carry, our range is from the 1940s until the 90s, with some very, very specific inclusions of earlier 2000s and certain pieces in the 90s. And the best way I can describe that is, for example, I had a woman come in last year and I bought several of her daughter's vintage prom, and we always called them dance dresses, but it was formal wear, from the 90s. And one of them is from a brand that I grew up with called Rampage. That was kind of the cool, like, if you didn't get anything from Delia's, you go to the mall and you'd find Rampage, and that was the cool 90s grunge era, but make it fancy teen line. And this dress had this beautiful burgundy and earthy tone floral underlay, and then the overlay was a sheer black mesh. Beautiful. That one sold right away. I loved it, but I couldn't keep it and hoard it. So very specific pieces and specific brands. If you remember from the 90s, the brand Bongo. I mean, again, very, very specific. And if we go into the very, very early 2000s, because now, we're in 2024. Once we hit 2025, 2000 will, by my definition, be considered vintage, but I loosen it up depending on what specific pieces there are. And those are pieces that are quintessential of that period in time that I don't see mass quantities of. Again, that part is a little bit on the rare side, and if I had more examples, I could better explain it to you. But generally, I go to about the mid-90s. Some vintage shops sell pieces earlier than that. Edwardian, 1920s, 1930s, and that's very specific to that vintage shop. Some vintage shops don't sell anything from the 90s, 80s, 70s, or even the 60s. And that's what makes vintage shops so cool, is every shop has its own focus and own personality. The reason why I don't carry pieces on my shop floor that are from the 20s or 30s are because I'm worried about the general wear and tear. Being that I have a brick and mortar shop, people come in, they look through the racks, touch, feel, try things on. And unless the piece is in the most pristine, sturdy as hell condition, I don't feel like it's the right choice for me to have those pieces on the floor. Now, I do sell those pieces, but typically they're online or for private buyers, just to keep them safe and in the best condition as humanly possible for my customers. So on my floor, if you see anything from the 1940s, then you know it's in immaculate condition, and you know once you leave the shop, it's not just going to fall apart. So that's my rule for my store. And as I said, different vintage shops have different guidelines that they follow. And that's really what makes it so cool. One of the most common questions I get when I have people coming into my shop who have never been here before and may not necessarily be as fully into the world of vintage as I am, which I'm pretty far down in there, is there are some people that ask, are you a thrift store? Or I'll hear, your prices seem higher than I would see at a thrift store. Why is that? And I love when people ask me, because it's a conversation that I really love to have. And there's a way to have it that's not condescending or trying to come down on someone for genuinely not knowing the difference. Because unless you're someone like me who grew up thrifting, who grew up going to vintage stores, antique stores, or consignment shops, you may not know the difference because you're human and you have different interests. So what I like to tell people, and these are the differences that I'm going to give to you, and people can agree or disagree or have a difference of opinion, but this is just what I define it as. Now, when you go into a thrift store, you definitely can have the luck in finding really great vintage pieces for a good price. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, before the onslaught of the internet and social media, I would often go to thrift stores to find vintage pieces for myself to collect and wear. Really, a lot of what they had at thrift stores were vintage. Whereas you flash forward to now, and it's a little bit harder to find good quality vintage pieces in thrift stores, but it's definitely possible. So, you go into a thrift store, you can find some really great vintage pieces, or you may not. You can go to another rack and you'll see more modern pieces, maybe from Target or Banana Republic or Gap, or insert any modern clothing brand. And so thrift stores run the gamut of what eras, what brands, and what you're going to find. It's whatever people are bringing in, whatever is gently used and in good, wearable, sellable condition. Whereas in a vintage store like mine, if someone were to bring in a dress they got 5 years ago from Nasty Gal, great condition, could even still have the tags on it, I would not purchase that because it doesn't follow my 25 plus year vintage rule. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, just means it's not vintage. And that's the main difference. I do not sell second-hand modern clothing. I sell pieces of very specific style and eras from the 1940s to the mid-1990s. And that's the main difference. Another big difference with thrift stores is that all of their inventory is donated. And usually thrift stores are nonprofits. But typically everything is donated, unless it's another specialized thrift store. Just for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to use the umbrella term for thrift stores, which is a nonprofit. In vintage shops like mine, sometimes we get donations. Usually it's people who just don't want to take any more stuff with them. They don't want to have to make another stop at a thrift store. And a lot of times they're pieces that I personally can't sell, but I make sure they find their way to people who can use them, whether it being donating to a shelter, or if pieces are ripped and shredded, but still could be reimagined into something great, I'll just give them to customers that I know who like to sew or who want practice projects. But 10 times out of 10, if you're seeing something on my floor, it's a piece that I paid for. And we also follow a very strict buying procedure where we'd give you more of what we feel like you're owed for the garment, and trying to make it as fair as we can, because we don't sell things for the hundreds or thousands of dollars. For the Fargo-Moorhead Midwestern area that we live in, a lot of shops like mine have to keep our prices fairly low. Otherwise, we'll never sell anything. So thrift stores, their pieces are donated, which means their prices are significantly lower. At a thrift store, you could find a 1950s dress that was donated. And I guess I don't know what a lot of thrift store prices are now. From what I've heard, I know they've gotten higher. Back when I was growing up, a vintage dress at a thrift store could be like $5. I'm sure now it can be more. But typically, it's going to be a lot less than if you were to walk into my shop, find a 1950s dress. Depending on the condition, the brand, the style, dresses can range from $25 on up, just depending. But typically they've been cleaned, mended, photographed, all that jazz. So when people come into my store and they think vintage is synonymous with thrift, they're often very surprised when they look at my prices and very confused. Which is why it goes back to the importance of knowing the difference and knowing what shop you're walking into. Because if you're someone that you are looking for a place to buy clothing that is really, really affordable, you don't have to break the bank spending over, like, I don't know, let's just say $10, and you're really running on a budget, you have to buy groceries and all of these bills that are piling up because of the age we live in, people are really suffering. And people are feeling the hurt financially. I fear someone walking into my shop who may not feel comfortable having this conversation with me, thinking I'm a thrift store, looking at my prices and thinking, oh wow, thrift stores are expensive. I can't go there anymore. And making it seem like it's not accessible, when in reality, I'm not a thrift store. So my prices are not indicative of what you're going to see at a thrift store. We are more specialized. And that's the thing that I really want to push out there, is that when I was growing up, thrift stores were very much for lower income families who couldn't afford to go to the bigger stores and spend $50, $60, $70, $80 on a pair of pants for back to school or a winter coat. Now today, thrift stores are widely shopped at by a lot of different people with a lot of different and varying incomes. And I never want someone to walk into my shop and think, oh, well, this is a vintage shop, which really is a thrift store, which means thrift stores are all more than what I'm able to spend. So I'm just not going to go into a thrift store and buy necessities that I need because I don't think I can afford it. Because in reality, they're two different things. And I never want anybody to be scared off, especially if they're getting into thrifting and they want to find really cool pieces and deals for under $10 or whatever thrift stores are pricing their items at. So that's where I want to make the very distinct difference that vintage shops are specialized. Thrift shops are just a combination of all different decades, styles, price ranges, so on and so forth. So when you are in a vintage shop that you've never been in before, just know we have our niches. We carry pieces that are a lot older, have some kind of provenance. So if it's not in your budget, not your jam, that's okay. You have so many other options. And we all know too, just like vintage shops, no matter where you go, a lot of thrift stores have different things and it's a treasure hunt every time. But those are the main differences that I really want people to know about. But another question I get that has been a newer question is that I've had people coming in, especially if they are wanting to sell pieces, asking if I'm a consignment shop. Now, when I was a kid, I remember my mom taking me to one of her favorite consignment stores in town that specialized in more size-inclusive secondhand clothing. But what I mean by consignment is that if I go to a consignment store and I have some great clothing, could be vintage, could be modern, but good clothing that the consignment shop owner likes and thinks that she has customers for, you strike up a deal where there's no money exchanged on site, but it's more of a contract where the consignment shop would say, do a consignment breakdown of 60% for the seller and 40% for themselves. So if I brought in this 5-year-old nasty gal dress that still has its tags on it, great condition, when this dress sells, I will get 60% of what it sells for, and the shop will keep the 40% because they're the ones merchandising it, pricing it, actually doing the physical work of selling it. So they keep a cut of it. And some consignment stores will even just offer store credit and, oh great, you sold this dress and we sold it for $40, so 60% of that, you can find anything in the shop that you want with that store credit. So it can be very different. And again, the majority of consignment shops I've seen do more modern clothing, but are more specialized in the particular clothing. And when I've been traveling, I go into some consignment shops that only focus on modern designer pieces. So things like Gap or Banana Republic, Marc J. Name a designer. Some consignment shops do alternatives of modern clothing from Target or Nasty Gal, anything like that. So again, consignment shops can have different focuses and different specialties. But what consignment means is that there is no money exchanged at the point of drop-off. There's only money exchanged when the item actually sells. And then it's usually a contracted, agreed upon setup or amount. Now, thrift stores, especially the nonprofit umbrellas, I don't know too much, but I don't believe they do any consignment. I could be wrong. Again, I don't own a thrift store, so I don't know the ins and outs. But for vintage shops, there are vintage shops that do offer consignment on pieces. I don't do it very often. When I do, it's for people that I've worked with or know really well or friends. And it's only on pieces that if this particular person wanting to sell it wants more upfront than what I would be willing to offer them as a vintage store trying to resell it, then we will try it at consignment. And so we can work out how much we would have to price this item at to where the individual would get what they want out of it. And then also, I wouldn't have to take the risk of spending more on a piece that I'm just not sure I can make my money back on. Again, unless it's something that you specialize in, for me, doing consignment can get really tedious. And I never want to pass on that stress to the consigner or consignee, whichever way it goes. But some vintage stores do consignment or are consignment vintage stores. So consignment can get a little confusing, which is why it's always a fair question to ask. Typically, when I've been getting that question, it's from people, again, coming in wanting to sell me pieces, asking if I do consignment or if I buy pieces right out. Now, to those who don't know what that means, I'll commonly get asked, I want to sell these to you. Do you do consignment? I say no. I typically just buy everything straight out. And some people don't quite know how that works. My shop, I go by I'm going to buy it right out for an agreed upon price to where it's fair for the seller, and it's also fair for me with my cleaning costs, mending fees, my POS fees, and so I can get my money back for the work and effort that I put into it. And that's why I rather just do the transaction there. And the great thing about that is if I have, and this does happen, if I have someone who what I'm offering them is just not what they wanted, then that's okay. Then they're not out any money. I'm not out any money. And I often give them references to other shops that may be willing to pay more. Or if they're interested in going the online route, I can give them options on where they could go to possibly sell their item for a price that feels better to them. So again, there are always options. Always options. And my goal is always to keep as much as I can from getting thrown away and in a landfill. Because ultimately, whether you're a consignment shop, a thrift store, or a vintage shop, you don't want pieces to get thrown away. And all three options prevent pieces that could be passed on to people who can use them from getting discarded and polluting the planet, because that's what it does. So it can get kind of confusing. And I understand why a lot of people think it's all the same, especially when you bring sustainability into it, because we all have the same common goal, and that is to save pieces. and save things from getting thrown that are just going to build up in landfills and cause a mess for generations to come. So it can get confusing, which is why I really wanted to dedicate an episode to exactly that and going through what I see all three as being. And the great thing is, whether it's a vintage store, a thrift store, or a consignment shop, you have options that are accessible to a lot of different income levels, a lot of different genders, interests. You have a plethora of places that specialize in different things and provide them for so many different means. And that's the great part of it. And that's the fun of it. Again, it is like a scavenger hunt and treasure hunting. You really never know what you're going to find from place to place. And again, as with consignment shops, thrift stores, and vintage shops, I've seen this happen too, and it's so fascinating, truly fascinating, is I'll go to vintage stores that have their own specialty. And let's say, there's a shop that is really hardcore into 30s and 40s, but really aren't that keen on anything above, especially the 70s or 80s. You could walk into that shop and see a 1970s gunny sax dress. And because that piece doesn't hold much interest or significance to them, you may get a gunny sax dress for $25-$30 because the shop owner isn't as excited about or interested in it, and they just want it to go to someone who's going to appreciate it. Whereas if you're a really big 70s buff, gunny sax, and how popular and how those pieces continue to be popular and have been for a long time because of their etherealness and nod back to the Dorian era. So it's really fascinating. I mean, in my store, I don't do a lot with the early 2000s. But if I do find a piece that, I know there are customers that would love this. And I know a specific customer that said they're looking for this particular coat and this style. And I don't normally carry it. It's not my area of expertise. But I'm going to get it, and I know it's going to go to the right person. If you go on Depop, some of these pieces can be upwards of $80, $90 to $100 for an early 2000s bomber jacket from Wet Seal. I don't know if any of you remember Wet Seal. That was my jam in junior high and high school. But to a seller like me who's not as connected to it, especially for someone who grew up in that era, I see it as, I know that there are customers that are going to want this and appreciate it. So yes, I paid for this, but I'm also going to sell it at a lower and reasonable price, just so I know it's going to someone who's going to love it and cherish it, and it's not going to get thrown. And you see that with a lot of vintage stores. Sometimes you see pieces that they're not your particular interest, but you can't pass it up, and you have a customer for it. You always hear, I have a customer for that. And that's the beautiful part of it. And that's why I love, in particular, being in the vintage clothing space. Because I get to see so many people that have way different interests in vintage clothing than I do, and even in modern clothing, and hearing about their adventures in hunting and thrifting and going to consignment shops, trying to find pieces that they love and make them happy. It's exciting, and that's why I get so excited about what I do, is providing these pieces that otherwise would have been lost to those who are searching and love and appreciate and want them. But if you find yourself in a store and you're not quite sure if it is a vintage store, if it's a thrift store, if it's consignment, never hesitate to ask. I don't know a business owner that wouldn't answer that, because that's part of what your job is as a business owner, is to educate people about the space that they are entering into. And that's why I love the conversation and why I want people to ask. That's how we learn. That's how we find different things that we get excited about. I had one customer come in who had never been to my shop before. They were visiting in town and they saw a vintage store. And they walk in and they look at a lot of my vintage pieces, but then they made it to the inner part of my store. And for those of you who haven't been in my store, we predominantly sell vintage, but because vintage is not always as size inclusive as I would like, I offer vintage inspired clothing done by small indie brands to attempt to bridge that gap. So when this customer came in and she ended up finding herself in our vintage inspired area, rightfully so, she got confused. And she asked me, "Wait, I thought you were a vintage store. Are you actually a thrift store? Because I know these pieces aren't vintage because they have modern clothing tags on it." And she could tell that they were not vintage. And that's where I got into the conversation of, actually, we're not, but this is why we have these newer pieces. But yeah, I totally get it. It can be confusing, but this is why we carry them. And it starts a great conversation. So that's why don't be afraid to ask. If you're coming from a place of true and genuine interest and you want to know, ask. Now, I have to put out there, and whether you own a vintage shop, a consignment store, a vintage store, I know in my deepest heart of hearts that you have gotten these comments. Something to the effect of, "Ew, I don't like secondhand. I don't like used clothing. I don't want someone else's stuff." And it doesn't matter if they're looking at a beautiful 1940s cocktail dress or that 5-year-old new with takes nasty gal dress. There are people that just don't want clothing that was owned by anybody else. I have family members. I know my grandpa, before he passed, and I would talk to him about having a vintage shop or show him the vintage pieces I bought before I owned a store. He was always so confused and interested in why someone, especially someone my age, wanted other people. And he would always say other people's stuff because he liked brand new. He liked being the first person to own something. My dad is very much the same thing. He wants a new house. He wants new clothing. And to each their own. There are some people that just, they're not interested and they want something brand new. They like the excitement of having something that no one else has owned and it's only ever been theirs. And that's completely acceptable. Obviously, we all have our own interests. But having said that, there are people that take it from a place of just different strokes for different folks and can get very condescending and almost insulting about it. And I know when I used to do more markets and talk to other vintage vendors, we would always just vent about, yeah, I had someone come into my booth and they looked at this beautiful 1950s dress and I heard this girl go, "Ew, I don't want a used dress." And it's all in the way it's said, and it's in the context that it's being said. I really do not like the term used for secondhand, pre-loved, or vintage clothing, only because the only times I've ever heard anyone describe what I personally have in my shop as being used is 10 times out of 10 being a negative remark and a negative connotation. So that's where when I have people saying that in my store, it makes me cringe, because I've never had anybody say it in a way that hasn't been rude, for lack of a better word. I've had people go, oh, this is a cool secondhand dress, or this is a cool pre-loved dress. And I never hear that ever said in it. This is an icky secondhand dress. The word used has really been marked as being negative in the vintage world. Now, the whole point of this episode is just to clarify the differences. And I'm hoping that listening to this and learning the definitions and just what I hear in my experiences in my own shop can help eliminate a little bit of the confusion. And ultimately, what it comes down to is, regardless of the way people see vintage shops, thrift stores, consignment, someone can walk in here and no matter what I say, they're going to see it as a thrift store, and that's fine. That is their opinion, and as long as they enjoy being in my store, they enjoy the pieces they get or the pieces that they're looking at, then really that's the point. I want people to have a good time in my shop and maybe learn something. Learn a little bit about the pieces that I get in and who I get them from, the stories behind them. I want people to take a little something with them. Be a little bit happier when they leave, or to take away a little bit of knowledge when they leave. And that really is my goal of this episode. So I'm curious, what do you all think? Do you sell vintage? Do you thrift? Have you gotten confused by what the difference is between all of them? Let me know. Because again, these are great conversations to have, and that is the entire point of this podcast. These are things that I hear from people all the time. And unless we have that conversation, and conversations are okay to have. If you don't understand what kind of shop my store is, that's perfectly all right. I don't expect you to know. Why would you if you're coming in here for the first time? So please just ask. Curiosity is not a bad thing. Having a question is not a bad thing. Great conversations that I'm bringing to you right now, that's the point. And I really wish more people would have them and feel comfortable having them and feel comfortable being in a space where they feel free to have those conversations. So I really hope this helped. And if not, and you still think that it's not a big deal, that's all right too. But you made it to the end of the episode, so I got you somewhere. I thank you all so much for joining me on yet another episode of Conversations in a Vintage Shop. And I appreciate you. And I really hope that you come back next week and hear what more I have to say about whatever topic I choose. I normally just come up with them off the top of my head or scribble them down in my notebook. And when I get that fit of of motivation, I just pop one out and record it. It's really fun that way, less stressful. I hope you all have an amazing, amazing week, and I will see you next time. Bye.